Welcome to our PowerPoint on Key Knowledge Point 5, where we're going to look at the fossil record. Specifically, we'll be looking at changes in species over geological time as evidence from the fossil record, faunal and fossil succession, index and transitional fossils, relative and absolute dating of fossils. And all of these we're going to look at together to get a good understanding of how species can change over time. So, looking at everything around us on Earth, we have some questions, or we've had questions about how did we get here? And particularly when we start to find the remains of organisms that we don't see anymore, we have these questions around how did we get from there to here? There's all this diversity around us, and that diversity is super important, not just within a species, but between species as well. And we see that the Earth's environments and these conditions that organisms live in are often changing. And so the species that live in those conditions need to have the ability to adapt to different conditions. That's why variety and variation is so important within a species. And that's going to help them avoid extinction. It is possible, though, obviously, that things happen and animals or plants do become extinct. And so over time, what we see is it looks like that there's been this change in the types of species that are present and the characteristics of those different species. You can see in the graph here, this is sort of a graph showing sort of current scientific thinking around the different levels of extinction occurrences in sort of time before now, really, and what's happened at different periods. And you can see there's sort of certain key spikes where there's been high levels of extinction, and these are normally what we call it like extinction events. But you can see there's obviously going to be significant changing in what species are present on Earth. If you have points in time where suddenly 50% of all species go extinct, well, what's left? What was there? These are questions that we're going to sort of hopefully address and look at the thinking around. There's a concept that you need to be familiar with called deep time. And this is sort of the current scientific view around how long the Earth has existed and how long life has been around. It's in millions of years, deep time. It's a bit hard not to just talk about time in millions of years. It's a big number. It's a bit frustrating. So we sort of talk about that length of time in the idea of deep time because it helps us with that scale of things. So really, it's the time scale of all these different geologic events, and it's the size of this scale is considered to be far, far bigger than the time scale around which scientists currently believe humans have existed for. So deep time is where we're looking at eons, eras, and periods and epochs. These are terms that we use to sort of describe certain amounts of time, and we often assign them special names to help us refer to them. They're all expressed in millions of years ago, which is represented as MYA. Sometimes you'll also see the term age used. It is the smallest out of those. So eons are the biggest, then eras, then periods and epochs, and then age would be the smallest. And so you can see in the diagram here that we've got some of those shown, and you can see how, big this time scale is and how little we think certain things existed for in the grand scheme of things.
Thanks to CuriosityStream for supporting PBS Digital Studios. Hey smart people, Joe here. Picture 5 balloons. That was easy. Now, picture 1,000. Well, that wasn't that hard, was it? Not so fast, smarty pants. That's only 399 balloons. That's 1,000. My point is, we stink at imagining big numbers. The human brain is good at so much, yet so bad at big numbers. Let's see if we can fix that. This big number fail isn't totally our fault. But during our evolution, we only had to pay attention to small numbers, like fingers, toes, how many people live in our clan. And beyond that, it was just, there's many mammoths over there, a massive magnitude, a multitude if you will. And that did just fine until we invented science and history and started using really big numbers. When it comes to putting big numbers in perspective, nowhere do we fail harder than in deep time. Deep time is the geologic time scale. It's the history of the Earth and everything on it. We're talking millions and billions of years, not tens or hundreds. And our brains are really bad at putting these huge magnitudes into perspective. For instance, my science brain knows a billion's 1,000 times bigger than a million. But then I think about the fact that 1,000,000 seconds is 11.5 days, and 1,000,000,000 seconds is 31.7 years. And my brain breaks a little. You know Cleopatra, the Egyptian ruler? Well, she died in 30 BC, a long time ago. But she lived closer to the first Taco Bell opening than she did to the Great Pyramid being built. And T-Rex lived closer to us than it did to Stegosaurus. What I mean is, we don't really understand deep time at all.
So I'm out here to put things in perspective for you. We're going to take an actual journey through the history of the Earth to see how long ago things really happened and how much time happened in between. The part of the history of the Earth will be played by this pink string. All along this are different events in Earth's history, and the distances in between those events are cut to scale based on how many thousands or millions or even billions of years ago that they happened. So let's start playing with some string. Here we are, about 4.5 billion years ago at the formation of the Earth. Kind of a big deal, kind of a major event in Earth's history. And apparently it happened next to this tree. Oh, the moon just formed. That didn't take long. I don't see it though. Cool. Oh, liquid water. Love this stuff. Kind of a big deal for life. Formation of the Earth's atmosphere. Earth is massive enough now that it can start keeping gases close to its surface thanks to gravity, but it was mostly stuff like carbon dioxide, ammonia, methane, none of this sweet, sweet oxygen stuff yet. Still not a lot happening right now. The first living organisms. This is kind of a big deal. At this time, Earth's conditions have settled down enough to let chemistry start doing whatever cool chemistry stuff it took to create the first known living things. Sure, they were simple, but they're your ancestors. Show some respect. About 1 billion years has passed from the formation of the Earth to this point, but we're just getting started. Not a lot going on here. Nothing that important. We've got oxygen. Now, for the first 1 billion years of life on Earth, there was nothing really making oxygen until cyanobacteria showed up and started doing photosynthesis for the very first time. So they were just spitting out oxygen as a waste product into the atmosphere, and since there was nothing there to really use it, it just built up over time and actually led to one of the largest mass extinction events in the history of the planet. Whoa, I see a big event coming. 2.2 billion years ago, the first eukaryotes. What does that mean? Well, that's when cells got organelles. You know, like the nucleus, the Golgi apparatus, the mitochondria, the
powerhouse of the cell.
Does anything happen on this planet? Oh, there's something. The supercontinent Rodinia broke up. Thought they'd stay together forever. Now, 710 million years ago, that means 3.8 billion years of Earth's history have passed to get to this point. And when you think about it, almost everything that we think about in Earth's history hasn't even happened yet. But we still have a long ways to go. 600 million years ago, the first multicellular organisms on Earth. That's right, all the life up until this point had just been single-celled, but now we get teamwork, cooperation, awesome multicellularity. Only things like us happen a lot further that way. Something cool happens right here. 540 million years ago or so is a period of time we call the Cambrian explosion. When we look at the fossil record, we just see this explosion in the diversity of life. It's when things got interesting. 470 million years ago, we get the first true land plants. They didn't look like these plants. They were a lot more basic. Things are about to start happening a lot more rapidly, so hold on to your hats. 400 million years ago, we find the first insect, the first amphibian, the first tree, and the first shark fossils, although I would assume not all in the same place. 359 million years ago, we find the first coal deposits. That's right, all those fossil fuels that we've been digging out of the earth and lighting on fire, they started forming about now. 315 million years ago, we get the first reptiles. Not dinosaurs, not that cool yet, although they were pretty cool. They just weren't that cool. 280 million years ago, the supercontinent Pangaea comes together. Maybe you've heard of it. 4.2 billion years has passed. We're just now getting to the first flowering plants. 230 million years ago, first dinosaurs. 200 million years ago, the Atlantic Ocean opens up for the first time. 180 million years ago, we get the earliest mammals and birds, which are still dinosaurs. This is all of history that we have left, and the Rocky Mountains are just now forming. Well, 65 million years ago, adios dinosaurs, that's the asteroid. 56 million years ago, we get the earliest primates. 40 million years ago, India hits Asia. This is basically everything we could consider human history. Australopithecus shows up for the very first time, an early walking hominid, just like Lucy. The first stone tools, the first controlled use of fire. Anatomically modern humans don't show up until here. And here we are at the present. And here we are in the present. Everything we consider our history happens in less than a millimeter from the end here. Looking back down the entire history of Earth. Dogs and everything. Stuff like the last Neanderthal, the extinction of the woolly mammoths, the rise of human civilizations is less than a thread in a thread of yarn. Whoa.
The moral of this story is that most things happened a really, really, really long time ago, and we humans are very new here. So go pick up a rock and take a second to respect your elders. On the bright side, even though I keep getting older, I'm actually still very, very young. And now I can prove it with string. Stay curious.
So just to show you and give you an idea of all the difference of time periods or eons and eras and everything, and what we name them and how they cover deep time. Got a little video here, just scrolling through this table. So if you're in class, you'll have a chance to do this timescale activity where you're going to basically make your own timescale using some toilet paper to help give you your line that you'll place the different events along. So from when the Earth was first formed, how has it changed? Scientists currently look at a few key things in how they think the Earth has changed since its formation, specifically looking at continental drift, climate change, sea change, and oxygen levels. They're all important, not just because scientists look at them as sort of the conditions required to support the presence of life, but they also think it's important in how, by putting pressure on that life, it's forced it to change and adapt and led to the changing of species. So we're going to have a look at each of these a little bit in turn. The first being continental drift. You've probably heard of this before. This is where we talk about the Earth's crust is actually divided up into tectonic plates. These float on a layer of fluid mantle, which is really molten rock, and that's all surrounding the core of the Earth. Because you basically have these solid masses floating on a liquid, they can drift and move. So the plates are in constant motion, and therefore any continents within those tectonic plates also will be in motion. And you know this because when these plates collide, they can lead to things like earthquakes, or when they move, volcanoes can erupt out of them and all that too. Some of the key points in continental drift would be, as you can see there, at 200 million years ago, it's believed that there was a supercontinent where all the land mass was together, called Pangaea, which means Pan means all and Gaea means land, so Pangaea means all land. That then broke up into two land masses called Laurasia and Gondwana. Then about 100 million years ago, scientists believe Gondwana broke up further into Africa and India, drifting northwards, and then South America, Antarctica and Australia initially staying together, and then closer to 45 million years ago, Australia and Antarctica being all that's sort of remaining of Gondwana land, and then having Australia break free and moving north of where Antarctica is. And you can sort of see that represented in the diagram below. So those are sort of some key points in how scientists think around continental drift, sort of over deep time and what's occurred there. And they look at geological types of evidence for this and fossil type of evidence for this. Specifically, geological and fossil evidence are going to be looking at things where if all land masses started together, then you'd expect there to be similarities in points where those land masses used to connect. And so you'd be looking to say, is there similar rocks or similar fossils in the crust at these points where we think land masses used to be connected together? You might look at paleomagnetic evidence as well, which is where the Earth's magnetic field every few million years actually changes polarity, so north and south flip. And you do actually have rocks in the crust that are affected by the Earth's magnetic field. And what happens to these rocks is that when they are being formed, the Earth's magnetic field will cause certain particles to align a certain way. And if that magnetic field is flipped, the particles would align a different way. And so by looking at the direction these parts of the rocks, these magnetic components within the rock are aligned, you can work out which way the Earth's magnetic field was and sort of work out when it's changed and when it's flipped back and forth. And so you can kind of get an idea also where that rock likely was based on the direction things are pointing back when it was being formed. You know, it might, if it's formed and you're looking at something and they think it's 100 million years old, and it looks like if this was formed 100 million years old, then it would have been down by Antarctica. That would imply that maybe even if this rock was on Australia, that part of Australia was actually down near Antarctica when that rock was originally formed. And so you can sort of trace things back by looking at where things should have been on the surface of the Earth back when they were being formed. So we have exam question 1 here. It says the Proteaceae family of plants contain the pin ice protea found in South Africa and the drumstick flower found in Western Australia. The figure below shows their distribution. No fossil evidence of the Proteaceae family has been found in the northern hemisphere. This distribution is most likely due to A. Convergent evolution, B. Artificial selection, C. Continental drift, or D. The founder effect. So you can pause the video, have a little bit of a think about that question, pick your answer, and then go check it against the video linked in the description box below. The next piece of evidence scientists will like to look at is climates and changing of the climate. And so initially it's believed that when the Earth was formed, it was very, very hot, and that over time the temperature of the Earth has fluctuated. But even though it has gone up and down, its overall trend has been in like a decline. It's descended. Now, looking at these fluctuations, some of those were potentially incredibly dramatic changes in temperature. You know, when you have it going for long enough, it may not look quite as big, but it would have been significantly impacting at the time. And that would have had an impact on the life living on Earth at that time, where if they weren't able to cope with those temperatures, be them very, very hot or very, very cold, then they wouldn't have survived long enough to exist into the next age, potentially. So you can see here just a graph showing you how it's thought that over deep time, how it is thought the temperature of planet Earth has fluctuated. This can also lead to things like changes in sea levels, and that's another thing scientists like to look at. Now, near the end of the Precambrian era, which is in the Carboniferous and the Permian periods, which are in the Oligocene epoch, very, very cold at this time. So you've got lots of snow, glaciers, and sheets of ice covering the Earth. That water had to come from somewhere, so it would come from what should have been in the sea, and so because that water has all gotten locked up in solid ice, it's actually caused the sea levels to drop. Now, in turn, if that all melts, it would cause the sea levels to rise. And you can actually track these sorts of things by looking at fossils of marine creatures. Where do we find them? How high up do we find them in rock? And that would indicate how high up water levels have come historically. And when I say historically, I don't mean necessarily it's not thought to be within human history, but historically within deep time. And so you can sort of track the impact of those changing climates by looking at the fossil record, especially plant fossils or even marine fossils, and tracking how their locations have changed. And that gives you an idea around things like sea changes as well. One of the other things that we would consider, or scientists consider, is looking at the availability of different nutrients and different elements in the atmosphere. And so it's thought when the Earth was initially formed, there was very little oxygen in the atmosphere. Now, most life on Earth nowadays requires oxygen. So if you need oxygen to survive and there's no oxygen, you're not going to survive. So early on, you would expect organisms that don't require oxygen, like cyanobacteria, to survive But that being said, where cyanobacteria might do really well in an environment with no oxygen, the interesting part though is that they actually make oxygen. So they don't need it, but they will make it. And so over time, the cyanobacteria are living their best life and they're thriving with these low oxygen levels. But they start to get so populous that they're able to actually help increase the oxygen levels. In fact, they did so well, it's very much thought to be they're the reason for the sort of great oxidation event where suddenly the oxygen levels on Earth massively jumped up. And now that the Earth's oxygen levels were high enough that they could support oxygen-needing life, all those organisms that maybe did require oxygen that would, if those mutations occurred and that sort of thing that required them to need oxygen, and they'd previously died off because there wasn't any, now when that was occurring in organisms, they weren't necessarily dying off because there was oxygen. And so it allows for the appearance and survival of those organisms that need oxygen, which you would then assume over time things should be getting more sophisticated organism-wise, and you'll start to see more complex organisms arriving that do require oxygen to survive, leading to, as scientists believe, what we see around us today. To give you an idea of when different things occur, you've got a diagram down the bottom, but I've sort of broken it up in the flow chart here. It starts off with bacteria. Then you get photosynthetic bacteria, like cyanobacteria, leading to aerobic microbes. These are microbes that require oxygen. Then you get unicellular eukaryotes. This is where we're first starting to see those more complex single-cell organisms. Then multicellular eukaryotes. Then corals. Then you get vertebrates, specifically jawless fish. Then insects, then land plants, then amphibians, then ferns, then reptiles, then conifers, which is a type of tree, like a pine tree sort of tree, then mammals, then birds, then flowering plants. And there's different reasons why we see these orders of things. But again, this is also reflected in the diagram at the bottom. And so this is the sequence you sort of need to have in your head. This is the order we see things appearing. And really it's going from least complex to most complex in a sense. With some limitations around there. So bacteria are, in this case, the ones you're starting with are ones that don't require oxygen, and they're very simple single-celled organisms. Then you get the photosynthetic ones. So we're starting to go, hey, we've got some bacteria that do a slightly more complex process. And then from there, because we have the oxygen being made, now we can have the aerobic microbes. Anything that's maybe a bacteria that requires oxygen, they can now survive. And from there, we go to a more complex cell, but it's still single-celled, and that's the unicellular eukaryotes. Then, once they're able to be established, suddenly you start seeing eukaryotic organisms that are not just one cell, but they're multicellular. From there, we go to corals, and then vertebrates, insects, and you can read through the rest of the list, but you can start seeing how this builds up this complexity. Here we have exam question 2. It says the timeline below summarizes the first appearance of some major groups of organisms in the evolution of life on Earth, as indicated by the fossil record. 3 major groups are missing from the timeline and are represented by the letters P, Q, and R. What are the correct groups of organisms labeled P, Q, and R? Are they A, bacteria, multicellular organisms, and insects? B, prokaryotes, non-flowering land plants, and eukaryotes? C, bacteria, reptiles, and dinosaurs? Or D, unicellular organisms, insects, and non-flowering land plants? So you can pause the video, work out your answer, and then check it against the video linked in the description box below. So how do scientists come to this conclusion that we've had these species changing over time and the way we think they've changed over time? Well, there's a range of different evidence, and we've got a range listed here: paleontology, which is fossils, biogeography, developmental biology, comparative anatomy, molecular homology. Most of those will actually look in later notes, like around key knowledge points 7 and 8, but we're going to look now around paleontology and fossils because we've been looking at the fossil records, so we're going to look in a little more detail at that. So the fossil record is this set of fossils where we look at it to sort of create a sequence and a timeline of when we think these different organisms lived and how we got from one to another. And scientists can use this fossil record to help track when and where different organisms have lived throughout history. What we're talking about here with fossils are preserved remains or traces of past life. You can have physical fossils, trace fossils, or you can even have what we call biomarkers or biosignatures. But one of the key principles that underpins this whole thing is this idea of the law of superposition. And that just means that anything further down is older, anything higher up is younger. We call these different layers strata, and so lower strata would be older and higher strata would be younger. So, as I said, fossils are preserved remains and traces of organisms. Interesting point there. It doesn't always have to be part of an organism. It can sometimes just be something that is a trace or something that's left behind by the organism. And what they're doing, these fossils, is they're providing evidence of past life. It could be things like hard parts, like bones, or you could be looking at impressions that get left in rock. A lot of the time when we see fossilized hard parts of organisms, they're found in rocks that have been made from sediment. So things like sandstone, or it comes from sand, and you can have silt and clay produce rock as well. And that's because these hard pits have been, the animals died, they've gone to the ground, sediment has been laid down over the top of them over time, and that's eventually compacted into rock. A lot of the time, fossils get destroyed by natural processes, weathering and erosion, and it's quite hard to get to the point of having a fossil because you have to have the organism die and be quickly covered to preserve them. What's interesting is, like I said, it doesn't always have to be the organism. We certainly have looked at things like footprints, provide types of fossils as well, but you can also look at other things that they leave behind, like poo. Poo can become fossilized. They're called coprolites. You can see an example of a range of them down the bottom and how we identify them. These are fossilized poos. One of the first things to go, does it look like a poo? If it does, maybe you've got some fossilized poo on your hands, or this coprolite. So that's one example of a type of fossil, not just the sorts of bones left in hard rock that we might normally think of. So how we form fossils is really important for you to understand. It's the remains of an organism or its direct evidence of its presence that's been preserved. So you could have footprints, you could have a cast or mold type of fossil. There's different kinds. Most often you're going to find it's the hard parts of an organism that get fossilized, like teeth, bones or shells, but there are certain conditions you have to meet. Really, you need hard body parts. Soft body parts don't get fossilized. They may leave behind the trace evidence, like an imprint, but they're not going to get fossilized the same way a bone would. Those remains need to be protected in some way. They can't be scavenged, they can't be eroded, they can't be damaged by other aspects of the environment. So anything where some rapid burial occurs, like a landslide, those are providing the ideal sorts of conditions. It's also why you see a lot of marine fossils, because when things die underwater, they very quickly fall to the bottom and get covered with sand, and they're protected in that. You also need high pressure, and this can come from layers of sediment being laid down over time and that building up, creating pressure. And that's important because it promotes the mineralization of remains. So this adding of minerals to those remains that are left there to make them nice and hard. And it's where those body parts actually will become fossilized rocks, is through the adding of those minerals. The other thing that you want is you generally want what we would call an anoxic environment. This just means low oxygen, and the reason this is important is it helps prevent decomposition by organisms that would normally cause things to rot and break down like that. This because those organisms need to live in environments with oxygen. By having low oxygen, they're not able to cause things to decompose and cause all that damage as easily. So it's actually a pretty rare process to have fossilization occur, because you have all these conditions that have to be met, and it's not always the easiest to meet them. And so a lot of the time when an organism dies, it disappears without leaving a trace. So here are the sort of stages we see in fossilization. You have death and decay. Soft body parts get decomposed or scavenged, leaving only those hard body part remaining. If you're really lucky, none of it gets scavenged, and that stuff will just sort of rot away or break down, leaving only the hard things in place. Then you have deposition. The hard remains get rapidly covered with silt and sand, and over time more layers continue to build. This is going to put pressure on it, leading to permineralization, where the pressure from the covering layers of dirt or rock cause the hard organic material to be replaced by minerals. But you have to find them, otherwise you never know that fossil's there. And so we have erosion or exposure, where the movement of the Earth's plates may displace the fossil and return it to the surface for discovery.
Like buried treasure, they lie hidden from sight. Echoes of an ancient past, they whisper secrets and tell tales once lost to time. Fossils are remnants or impressions of ancient organisms that are naturally preserved in stone. While there are hundreds of fossil types, they are often grouped into two major categories: body fossils, which are the preserved remains of plants and animals, and trace fossils, which are records of an animal's behavior, such as footprints. Together, they form the fossil record, a primary account that tells the story of life on Earth through stone. Fossilization, or the process of preserving organisms in stone, can occur in countless ways. These methods are largely grouped depending on whether the organisms are altered during the fossilization process. Fossilization that does not alter a specimen can help to preserve its original form and texture. Among many methods, this group includes organisms that have been frozen, preserved in tar pits, and mummified. One special case involves trapping organisms, oftentimes insects, in amber. This process begins when an organism is covered in tree sap. The sap, or resin, forms a protective seal around the entrapped organism. Over time, the soft resin hardens and turns into amber, with the organism suspended within. This process creates a biologically inert tomb for the organism, allowing its soft tissues to be remarkably preserved. Other fossilization methods change the specimen as it is being preserved. For instance, carbonization transforms soft tissues into thin black films of carbon. In fact, countless layers of carbonized plant material create a well-known fossil fuel, coal. But one of the most common types of fossilization that changes a specimen is called permineralization. Permineralization begins when minerals from water or the ground enter the pores of dead plant or animal material. Over time, the minerals attach themselves, clinging onto cellular walls and building a crystalline network in the empty cavities. This mineralization hardens the bone and turns it into stone, thereby preserving its original structure in fossil form. When conditions are right, fossilization can preserve crucial information about an organism. Permineralized wood often contains enough information to identify its tree genus and sometimes its species. Insects encased in amber have been so well preserved that their genetic material was extracted and partially sequenced. And footprints left behind by ancient hominins help paint a picture of what life was like for early human ancestors millions of years ago. With every fossil uncovered, the planet's ancient past becomes clearer, helping shape our understanding of our world today.
So exam question 3 says 𝕃𝕚𝕟𝕂𝕏 fossils have been found at Emu Bay in South Australia. 𝕃𝕚𝕟𝕂 was a predatory shrimp-like invertebrate measuring 60 centimeters in length. It had long spiny frontal appendages and a powerful disc-shaped mouth made of overlapping hard plates. The Emu Bay fossils were found in layers of shale and dated back to about 520 million years ago. 𝕃𝕚𝕟𝕂𝕏 fossils that have been found around the world suggest that this genus existed for at least 50 million years. Factors that would have contributed to the fossilization of this animal include A. Its predatory way of life, B. The action of waves and currents, C. The salt content of the water in which it lived, or D. Its hard-plated mouth and shiny appendages. So you can pause the video, have a bit of a think about the answer, pick your option, and then check it against the video linked in the description box below. Exam question 4 says 2 early hominins were fossilized in 2 different areas of Africa. One hominin was quickly buried during an avalanche, while the other was buried slowly on a forest floor. The figure on the right represents these 2 different possibilities for fossilization of the hominins. A. Outline one reason why the hominin in the forest would have had a greater chance of being only partially fossilized. B. State one factor not indicated on the diagram that would increase the chance of fossilization of an organism. So again, pause the video, write down your answer, and then check it against the video linked in the description box below. So let's dig a little bit deeper into the types of fossils there are. We have physical fossils, trace fossils, and biosignatures, and we're going to look at each in turn. Physical fossils are really, when I say fossil, that's probably what you think of. You've got preserved organisms where you might have a whole organism, or maybe just part of one, completely preserved in a substance. Things like amber, ice, and tar are really common at doing this, and they allow that to happen. Mineralized fossils, where when we were talking earlier about how it gets buried and then the minerals replace the hard parts, this is a mineralized fossil where those organisms' remains are buried, the organic material gets replaced by the minerals, leading to something that has the same shape and form as the original organism's bits, like a bone for instance, but it's now made up of all these minerals instead of what it was originally made up of. Or you could have fossil impressions where it gets buried, but then all that organic material disappears after burial, and instead it leaves an impression or a cavity. It's known as a mold, and if later that impression gets filled with a different substance, then it's a mold and cast, because you've had something cast in the mold. So that's another type of physical fossil that you can have. Your trace fossils are where you have evidence of the activities of the organism that have been preserved. Footprints, tooth marks, tracks, burrows, 𝗘𝗃𝗺𝗺, the fossilized poo. Those are all things, they're not the organism itself, but they're the things the organism has left behind. Markers that they were there, either physically because they've marked the ground with their movement or because they left a poo behind. And so these can also get fossilized as well. And the third one is biosignatures. This is a really interesting one. Sometimes we call them biomarkers, and it's where you have this evidence that you can sort of from that infer that maybe earlier life existed. So they're more of a clue than any physical evidence. So what you're looking for here is a physical or chemical sign that gets preserved in minerals, rocks, or sediments, and you can infer that, well, it's cellular, and so how did it get there? Well, it must have been because there was some living organism previously that's not there anymore that was doing some metabolic activities, and that's what's produced this chemical signature. Stromatolites are an example. You can see an image of them there. They're layered rocks, and they build up one layer at a time. And what's really interesting is we can see that they've got remnants of compounds that would only have been produced by living organisms. And so we've worked out that they're getting made by having these microbial colonies of cyanobacteria trapping sediments. Now, those cyanobacteria eventually die off, and they leave sort of this framework there that helps to trap all that sediment, turning it into these stromatolite rocks. But because the stromatolites are not part of the bacteria themselves, nor are they technically a trace that the bacteria has left behind, they get this extra layer, and we call them these biosignature ones. And you can actually see stromatolites in Western Australia to this day. Now, exam question 5 says, consider the close-up image on the right of a dinosaur footprint discovered by scientists. This type of fossil is best described as A, preserved remains, B, a petrified fossil, C, a trace fossil, or D, a cast. You can pause the video, pick your answer, and then check it against the video linked in the description box below. So the fossil record. Now we know what fossils are. What is this fossil record we keep hearing about? Well, it's taking those fossils we find to create a timeline of all life on Earth. That is the fossil record. It helps to give an idea of when and where different organisms lived, and to properly do this, not only do you need to have an idea of what the fossils that you've got are, you need to have an idea of maybe when they actually existed, so you can actually put them in the timeline. So this does mean we might use fossils in an interesting way. We can have some fossils acting as index fossils, and others acting as what we might call transitional fossils. Now, to properly understand the fossil record, particularly given that these fossils are coming from different locations around the world, you need to remember this idea of faunal succession, also known as fossil succession. And so this is just the idea that as you have rock layers being laid down, those that are nearer to the surface are going to be younger. They've more recently been laid down. And therefore, we can also make the similar assumptions about fossils we find in those layers. Fossils found in higher layers are going to be younger than fossils found in lower layers. So relatively speaking, you can kind of get an idea between certain organisms of who's older and who's younger. If you know more precisely the ages of fossils in a certain layer, you can even narrow it down a little bit further than that. What you can also do is, if you have really distinctive fossils that only occur in a certain layer at a certain time, when you see them in other places, you can also say, hey, that layer in this other place must also have been laid down at this same time. And so it can help you with dating samples from other places that you might find those fossils. Key little point there, by the way, when we say fauna, we mean animals, and when we say flora, we mean plants. So when you see those words about, that's what they mean. Now, I mentioned before the idea that some fossils can be index fossils and some fossils can also be called transitional fossils. Index fossils are ones that we use to specifically define a geological period. This thing is only found here. It's a bit more than that. It's only found here in this region, and it's only found for a short time, but we find it in heaps and massive amounts. And it's not necessarily like crazy widespread, but it is fairly common to this area for this short time period. And so what that means is because we know that these organisms only exist for these short times, we don't find them crossing lots and lots of layers of rock. We tend to find them just in like one specific layer. And so it can indicate kind of the time point of that specific rock strata has come from. It does also mean that if you find other fossils with it, they must have also come from the same time point, because that rock gets formed at the one time, so all the fossils in there must have all been formed at that same time. And so we can use that in what we call relative dating of fossils. Transitional fossils, on the other hand, are where we might consider these more evolutionary intermediates, where we have an ancestral species and we have a modern species, but we want to know what they look like in between. And these fossils are thought to potentially be the remains of the species that were in between that ancestral one and the modern one. The two sort of examples that you might commonly come across are the 𝕃𝕚𝕟𝕤𝕤𝕤, which is a species that has both avian, so bird, and reptilian features, thinking to help bridge that gap between what scientists believe is the evolution from or between birds and reptiles and what's shared there. And 𝕃𝕚𝕟𝕠𝕟 is a Devonian plant. It's a time period that doesn't have seeds, but it seems to have this structure that's a precursor to what we see as seeds in plants nowadays. So exam question 6 says, an index fossil may be used for identifying A, the oldest rocks in a series of strata, B, the age of rocks from the Jurassic period only, C, the absolute age of a sedimentary rock stratum, or D, sedimentary rocks of the same age in different locations. So you can pause the video, work out your answer, and then check it against the video linked in the description box below. So something I mentioned earlier is you do actually want to have an idea of the age of the fossil and you want to date it. There are two kinds of dating we are talking about here. There's relative dating and absolute dating. I've already mentioned relative dating a couple of times, and it does not mean to date your cousins. Relative dating is talking about what is the age of these two things relative to each other. Given their position in the ground, how do they relate to each other? Who's older, who's younger? That sort of thing. It's a less precise form of dating, whereas absolute dating is considered the more precise form of dating that you can do to a fossil. So we're going to have a little bit of a look at what we're talking about here.
How are there still footprints of dinosaurs? I mean, it feels like they would have washed away. I don't understand.
You're probably right that 90% of all tracks that were made did wash away, but if you have just the right consistency of the substrate, the sand or the mud, it would take a very nice impression, and it could also dry out, so it becomes more like cement.
How do we know when these marks were made?
Dr. Lockley explains that paleontologists primarily date fossilized markings, like the scratches, by determining the age of the rock on which the impression is left. That's often done with a process called radiometric dating. It's a method that relies on elements found in the rock. Over time, each element will shed neutrons and decay at a known rate that scientists can measure to get an approximate date for the rock's surface. But the key elements found in sedimentary rock where fossils are usually discovered decay too rapidly to be a reliable dating source for such old surfaces. However, there are elements that exist in volcanic ash, like uranium and potassium, which decay more slowly. So geologists will look for layers of ash above and below the rock in which the fossils are found. By dating each layer of ash, they can determine an age range for the rock and the fossils in question.
So relative dating, as I said earlier, this is where you're looking at a rock or a fossil in the rock, and we work out its age based on other rocks or other fossils that you find nearby. This requires very much an understanding of sedimentary rocks and that idea that things are laid down in layers. And so this won't give you the age in years. What it's doing is it's helping you put things in order, sort of from, generally speaking, maybe oldest to youngest, and where other things fit into that timeline. So relative dating, like I said, much less precise. It's more about just helping you get an idea of generally the order that things occur in. and more that which one's older, which one's younger. Absolute dating, on the other hand, is considered more precise. It's called chronometric dating or radioisotope dating sometimes. There's a couple of different names in there. And this is actually looking to find a numerical age, an age in years that you can actually assign to a fossil or to a rock sample. There's a number of different techniques you can use here, and the technique you use is appropriate for different situations. So radiometric is probably the most common one that most people have heard of, but there's also something called electron spin resonance and luminescence. And we use these techniques and they're based on different physical and chemical properties of the rock or fossil, rather than when we looked at relative dating where we're making a lot of assumptions to come up with that sequence. So radiometric dating is where we rely on the idea that there are certain elements that decay because they are radioactive, they're radioisotopes. For example, carbon-14 is a form of carbon that is unstable and will decay. Most of the time when we talk about carbon, we're normally talking about carbon-12, so this is a different isotope of carbon. Uranium is one that we're very familiar with being a unstable radioactive element, and it's another one that we might use, so is potassium-40 or rubidium-87. And so what all of these isotopes have in common is that their nucleus is unstable. It's the ratio of protons to neutrons in them is generally not something that's able to keep stable. And so over time, that nucleus breaks apart. When it does that, it releases energy. That's what we would call radioactivity. It might release alpha particles or beta particles or even gamma rays. What we do find is it seems to be that they have a sort of consistent rate. At least we rely on them having a consistent rate that they decay at. And different isotopes have different rates. So you can see that carbon-14 is thought to have a decay rate of 5,578 years for its half-life. Uranium is 704 million years for its half-life, and the others you can see get longer than that. You notice that we say half-life here, and the way we read a decay rate is we look at, if we have a sample, how long does it take for half of that sample to decay? And that's your half-life. So that would mean, like, if I had a kilo, how long does it take before it becomes half a kilo? And for carbon, let's round up and say it's 6,000 years. So carbon, if you start off with a kilo, in 6,000 years you'll only have half a kilo of carbon-14. Another 6,000 years after that, you'd have half of half. So you would only have 250 grams at that point. If you wait another 6,000 years, you'll have half of that. And you keep going and you keep going. And so half-life is the term we use to measure this radioactive decay. And you can see a little graph on the right there showing how this works. So you always start with 100%, and as that decays over time, you keep halving the amount you have there. A little bit more detail, we'll use carbon-14 again as our example. Let's say an organism dies. If it has any carbon-14 in it, which is completely possible, that carbon-14 will continue to decay at a steady rate. As it decays, it's becoming nitrogen-14, and that's important because we can do one of two things when we want to measure this. We can measure how much carbon-14 is left or how much nitrogen-14 is present. And so after the organism dies, we see very much that the amount of carbon-14 should be decreasing, but the amount of nitrogen-14 will increase. And so by looking at those two values, how much carbon-14 is there, how much nitrogen-14 is there, you can get an estimate in conjunction with the half-life of carbon-14 of how long it's been since that organism died. Now, with carbon-14, because it's such a short half-life, you'd only use it for things that have been made very recently. So often when we actually look at fossils, you might be looking at one of the other kinds. Carbon-14 can be really useful for things like pottery and that sort of thing, where the time in the past that those sorts of things were made is still within the thousands of years, not necessarily the millions of years. Another thing you can do, instead of looking at the numbers, the amount of carbon-14 and nitrogen-14, you can actually look at how much carbon-12, which is the stable version of carbon there is, and how much carbon-14 there is. That combination can also be used in conjunction with the half-life of carbon-14 to give an estimate of the age of the sample. And so you can see in the image there, it's just showing if you start off at death, you have all this carbon-14, then nearly 6,000 years later, you're only going to have half of that. Add another 6,000 years, you're only going to have half of that, 50%, and you keep going down. And if you can work out how much you originally started with, how much you now had, you can work out how many times it's gone through that half-life process, and therefore how old your sample actually is.
The carving of Mount Rushmore was completed in 1941, but the rocks it was carved into were completed quite a bit earlier than that, 1.7 billion years ago. How does a geologist know that? And how do they know that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old? The answer is a technique called radiometric dating, which lets us tell the age of certain types of rock. Radiometric dating relies on the fact that certain elements have what are called isotopes. These are versions of the atom with extra neutrons in them. Each radioactive isotope decays at a consistent rate. These measurements give us something called the half-life, or the amount of time it takes for 1/2 of the isotope to decay. When an isotope's half-life is up, half your original element will be gone, transformed into a different isotope. Another half-life and you're down to 1/4 of your original amount. A half-life after that and you're down to 1/8, and so on. The length of a half-life is different for every isotope. If you wait for enough half-lives to pass, you'll have a hard time detecting any of your original material. So to date something relatively recent, you want an isotope that decays quickly. To go older, you want an isotope that decays very slowly. The term carbon dating refers to dating using carbon-14, which we mentioned earlier. It has a half-life of 5,700 years, and most of it will be gone by about 50,000 years. To date things that are older than that, you want an isotope that decays very slowly. Uranium-238 has a half-life of 4.5 billion years, so it can be used to date things as old as the solar system itself. How do we use this to get the age of something? The unstable radioactive element that you use is called the parent, and the stable, happy isotope you end up with is called the daughter. Dating only works if the only source of the daughter isotope is the decay of the parent. You also need a rock that behaves a bit like a sealed time capsule, preventing daughter isotopes from leaving and keeping new parent isotopes from wandering in. That way, if you end up with half daughter and half parent isotopes, you know that one half-life has gone by, since the rock kept everything locked into the same place. Certain minerals form a tinker toy-like cage around any larger isotopes. This locks everything in place and makes for an excellent time capsule. Zircon crystals, for example, can trap atoms of radioactive uranium inside them, as well as its daughter isotope, lead. So, measure the proportion of uranium to lead in a zircon crystal, and you can figure out when it must have formed. Take this tiny zircon, for example, which would fit comfortably on the head of a pin. Believe it or not, this tiny zircon, which comes from Western Australia, is the oldest piece of Earth we've ever found. It's an absolutely mind-blowing 4.4 billion years old, and comes from when the Earth was only 150 million years after its formation. The zircon was dated using two different isotopes of uranium, uranium-235 and uranium-238. This provided a built-in cross-check, as you had two different clocks keeping time within the crystal. Whichever clock you look at, they give the same result. The uranium's been trapped in that zircon since it formed 4.4 billion years ago. Most dating techniques only work with certain types of rock. You can tell when lava erupted, for example, but can't figure out when sandstone formed. That's because the sandstone doesn't trap isotopes in the tinker toy-like cages that we mentioned earlier. Because there are other ways to tell how old things are in the world, we can compare those results with radiometric dating and show that they match. Trees, for example, put down a new ring each year they grow, and you can count backwards and figure out how old the tree is. You can also use carbon dating to figure out how old a particular ring on the tree is. Just like trees, ice in the Antarctic lays down a new layer each year, creating a similar ringed pattern. We can then compare that to the dates given by rocks trapped in the ice and show that they also match. If radiometric dating weren't reliable, we'd see differences between the results generated by it and those generated by these other methods. Fortunately, radiometric dating is reliable, which means if we go to Mount Rushmore, we know we can touch rocks that are 1.7 billion years old.
So exam question 7 says the technique of carbon dating would be most suitable for dating organic remains that are aged at 4 billion years and beyond, 4 million years, 400,000 years, or 40,000 years. Pause the video, pick your answer, and check it against the video linked in the description box below. Let's try question 8 now. It says one form of dating the age of a fossil is by radioactive carbon dating. The ratio of carbon-14 to nitrogen-14 in the fossil is analysed and compared with the ratio of these elements in an organism living today. The graph below shows the rate of decay for carbon-14. A fossil kangaroo skull was found in a limestone cave. The skull's carbon-14 to nitrogen-14 ratio was analysed and found to contain 1/4 of the carbon-14 of a kangaroo that died in 2012. A. Place an X on the curve to show the fossil's carbon-14 to nitrogen-14 ratio. And B. Given the half-life of carbon is approximately 6,000 years, what is the approximate age in years of the kangaroo skull? So you can pause the video, work out your answers, and then check them against the video linked in the description box below. Alright, this brings us to exam question 9. It says carbon dating analysis is not always possible and the age of the fossil can be estimated by dating the rock in which it is found. A. Why is carbon dating analysis not always possible? And B. Name another absolute dating technique that can determine the age of the rock surrounding a fossil. So pause the video, write down your answer, and then check it against the video linked in the description box below. So I mentioned there were 2 other sorts of techniques we could use when it came to absolute dating. These are both on the newer side of techniques, and so not as commonly heard of. Electron spin resonance is a new technique where we look at the minerals in the rock or the organic material that's been left behind, and you're looking at the electrons in those minerals. The theory goes like this. When you bury an object, there's all this bombardment of natural radiation. It's completely normal. But as they're being bombarded by this natural radiation, they do build up some higher energy electrons. Those electrons kind of become fixed within these crystalline lattices and they're slightly magnetic. Now, this magnetism can actually be measured to give what we call an ESR reading, so electron spin resonance reading. Once you've taken that, it gives a measure of how much radiation it's experienced. And obviously, the longer that sample is in the soil, the longer it's had to be bombarded, the higher you would expect that reading to be. And so you can kind of get an idea, once you ignore sort of what we might consider a background dosage rate, that everything would get just from existing, not necessarily being buried. Once you've eliminated that and you look at what remains, you would assume that all that radiation has come from just when it was buried in the soil. And therefore, you can get an idea of how long ago it was buried based on how long it's been in the soil or in the rock. And so that's how electron spin resonance works. It's a newer technique, it's quite interesting. And really, you're just trying to work out how long something has been buried for. Luminescence, on the other hand, also known as thermoluminescence, and optically stimulated luminescence are 2 other forms of absolute dating. What they're doing here is they're looking at characteristics of minerals within sedimentary rock. The way they work is radiation strikes a mineral crystal, energy from that radiation can be trapped within the crystal, and it's only released when exposed to heat or light. So this is not one you need to have a particularly strong understanding of, but it's just there for you to see as another kind that we can look at different characteristics of minerals by looking at what occurs with radiation hitting them. Now, before we go much further, I want to talk about potentially a flaw in the fossil record, or flaws, plural. It's not perfect, and there's certainly what we'd call bias in it. You need to remember that fossilization requires some really specific and rare conditions. Not every species from the past is going to get fossilized. And because of that, your fossil record's not complete. And not only is it not complete, there's certain biases that are present due to geological, physical, chemical, and biological factors. When I say bias, I mean something that skews the data. So, geographic bias. A lot of the time, we find fossils from lowland areas or marine habitats. And the reason for that is those environments are really good at leading to fossilization, much more so than a lot of other areas. So those really high areas or those really hot areas maybe don't allow fossilization to occur. It's much harder for it to happen there. So that's the first kind, geographic bias, that where the organism's from is either going to make it more or less likely for it to become fossilized. The next is taxonomic bias, and this particularly ties into geographic when we're talking about marine fossils. Most fossils are marine fossils. That's a heap, so much. But if we look at all the species that we should be considering that we should find in the fossil record, only like 10% of them are marine. So we have heaps and heaps of fossils of things that really only make up 10% of all species. 2/3 of extant animal species don't have hard parts. So there's nothing that's in that species that would lend itself to being fossilized. So it's unlikely it'll ever be fossilized and ever be in the record. A lot of the time, parts like flowers or plants don't get fossilized. They're just not hard enough. So certain aspects of a plant may be lost. You know, is our fossil record really complete if the fossils in it themselves aren't complete? The other thing is temporal bias. Temporal here meaning is in related to time. And so this is the idea that older rocks are more rare than newer rocks. They were made longer ago. There's been more time for them to be lost. Maybe they've gotten subducted into magma underground and just completely lost them. If that happens, they take their fossils with them. Or what if something has been eroded away and destroyed in that? So for things that are really, really old, we probably have really poor sampling of them because we just don't have those rocks present anymore. We've lost them just because they're really old. So these are all things that you need to consider. The fossil record is never going to be perfect, and these are 3 key reasons why. They're not necessarily the only things, but these are 3 things to certainly keep in mind. Now, I mentioned at the very start that as things change, in environments on Earth change, things can become extinct. And one of the ways from the fossil record where we can work out if something's become extinct is we look at if there are fossils of this species. Where do we see them occurring and where do we see them not occurring? And if suddenly there's heaps of these fossils in really early rock layers and then suddenly absolutely none in any other rock layer that's younger than that, that kind of starts to indicate to us that this is probably an extinct organism. Now, there are 2 ways we talk about extinction. There's background extinctions and mass extinctions. Background extinctions, unfortunately, things happen and naturally, and things do go extinct. Generally speaking, though, this is occurring at the same rate as new species being formed. So this tends to not be affecting massive numbers of species. There's only a few here and there. It's not a very severe level of extinction. It's sad, but it happens. Mass extinction, on the other hand, is normally because there's been some catastrophic event that has led to the destruction of heaps of different species at a global level. It's very severe. It's a lot rarer, but it's a lot more intense at the same time. There's been about 5 major mass extinctions in the last 600 million years or so. That's what scientists consider to sort of be the number that we've seen happen. So here in this other graph, you can see that we have the blue dashed line is sort of the approximate background extinctions. These are the things you'd expect normally to be occurring. And then the red line is the actual extinction rate. And you can see there are some significant peaks above that, and those are going to be your mass extinctions. The graph beneath it is a little bit more highlighting where the problems are, but it's going the other way. It's where the dips are on that one. That indicates a loss of different families, like a number of different families of organisms, that sort of thing. And so when you have a big dip, that's a big mass extinction in the second graph there on the page. So hopefully this has given you a really good overview of the fossil record as we come to the end of our notes here. But you need to take all this in and just use it to help you understand, like we were saying at the start, that we have this diversity of life on Earth, but how did it get here? And understanding that can be done through the fossil record. So we're at the end of the PowerPoint. If there's anything you didn't understand, you can go back and rewatch that section or reach out to your teacher for further clarification. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video. Bye.